Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
My name is Keith. I am your host for today, whatever day of the week that happens to be. For me, that day is a Sunday. And this week, we are going to be getting into more book content. I found that after the analysis that I did with Blade Runner, I was hungry for some more literary analysis that is of the science fiction persuasion. So I decided to finally cave and purchase the audiobook for the Hyperion series, the first book of the series. I have mentioned it several times on this podcast before. I only got through like the first 50 pages and I loved every bit of it. I thought that it was really a pretty crowning achievement in Dan Simmons' overall catalog as far as writing is concerned. He is a pretty prolific writer, so there's definitely a lot of options of, books and things of his to read. So I would recommend checking him out, but I would specifically recommend checking out Hyperion. I'm going to talk about the first, I don't know if I want to call it chapter. I think it might actually be the first chapter of the book, because it is a very long chapter, but I think that it kind of goes in parts, very similar to like Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and that is intentional on Simmons' part. The book is essentially about the pilgrimage of several individuals who are traveling across a star system in the distant future. I want to say like 1,000 years or something like that. They're traveling across the star system to travel to a specific planet called Hyperion. And part of the reason that they're traveling there is because of this overall meta-narrative where there is this conflict between essentially what's called the hegemony, which is like the governing body of the human race that spans like the entire known universe. And this conflict between a bunch of, I guess they call them space barbarians in the book. They're essentially just kind of nomadic raiders. You could kind of compare them to like the Mongol hordes, but they are in space. And we don't really have any contact with them. We just hear about them, at least in the first chapter. So I don't know what role they're going to play just yet. I haven't finished the book. I figured that it would be a good idea to kind of talk about it as I went, because it is quite a commitment to listen to the book. It's like 20 hours on the audiobook, and to read it, it's like 800 pages. So there's definitely a lot of material here. The basic overall synopsis of the book, just to review, is in the 29th century. Okay, so that's where we're at, 29th century, which is 900 years from now, 800 years from now. The hegemony of man comprises thousands of planets connected by Farcaster portals. The hegemony maintains an uneasy alliance with the Techno-Core, which is a civilization of artificial intelligences. Modified humans known as ousters live in space stations between stars and are engaged in conflict with the hegemony. Numerous outback planets have no Farcasters and cannot be accessed without incurring significant time dilation. So kind of like an Interstellar, there's like a time gap for traveling through space. One of these planets is Hyperion, home to structures known as the Time Tombs, which are moving backwards in time and guarded by a legendary creature known as the Shrike. On the eve of an ouster invasion of Hyperion, a final pilgrimage to the Time Tombs has been organized. the pilgrims decide that they will tell their tale of how they were chosen for the pilgrimage. So I'm not sure exactly how much of the book is going to get into the actual process of the pilgrimage, though they do give us some interesting details, or at least Simmons gives us some interesting details as to like certain facets of the journey and what the results are supposed to be. There's kind of like this idea that there's kind of like an only one will return mentality. So that is interesting. Again, I'm only just finishing with chapter 1, so we're going to be focusing on that. I can't speak much to the overall meta-narrative of the book because I haven't gotten past the first chapter, but the first chapter, because the book is structured similarly to the Canterbury Tales, each of these chapters, I'm suspicious, will be like one single story that kind of stands alone, if you will, that contributes to the overall meta-narrative. It's kind of like a Quentin Tarantino movie or The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, which is essentially this novel but without the strong meta-narrative that kind of pulls all of the characters together. In The Illustrated Man, it's just one guy telling his story to another, or his stories to another person as to why his body has all these tattoos on it. So there's kind of a sense of mystery there, and I do recommend that book, absolutely. But as far as like an overall literary accomplishment is concerned, I would say just from my brief soiree with Hyperion as of now, Hyperion is just kind of the superior book. So the first chapter, I'll kind of just give you a summary. After you meet all of the characters, you get a lot of description about the characters. There's a lot of focus on the characteristics and the physical appearances of I want to say it's 7, because it has to be a prime number, which it seems like numbers are very important to Simmons, as the first story definitely revolves around, the 70. So 70. Also the number 7, which I find to be interesting. It revolves a lot around numbers, and it seems that there is definitely some pretty heavy-handed religious commentary that's happening. But the first story kind of focuses on a trope that's pretty standard in science fiction as well as fantasy. And the focus the trope is essentially the idea of immortality. And the way in which Simmons handles this is pretty fascinating to me, because he combines a lot of standard science fiction tropes with this really complex idea that is decidedly Nietzschean, which is going to be kind of a big thing to tackle, so definitely be prepared. So, for backstory, Nietzsche is an existentialist philosopher. I mentioned him last week. A lot of people associate him with nihilism. He only talked about nihilism in the sense of how much he hated religion because he believed that it caused nihilism within individuals. And there is definitely kind of like a representation of that in this short story. I'm going to be giving away, I wouldn't call them spoilers necessary, just a lot of plot points about the chapter. So I do highly recommend reading the book as we go along or listening to it. But if I'm being honest, the biggest twists and the things that kind of make the story really memorable and powerful, I'm not going to have to give away in order to talk about these concepts. But I will be giving away like certain details that you would have otherwise been curious about, but I don't think that those details are important to understanding like the motivation of the characters or things like that. So, of the 7 characters, the first character to tell their story is Father Hoyt, who is a member of the Catholic Church. And there's definitely some commentary from Simmons as to the longevity of these religions and the religious beliefs of individuals. There's a conversation that one of the other passengers has during their first time meeting everybody, where he mentions how many different religious and spiritual belief systems he's kind of cycled throughout his time being alive. And he's been alive for a long time because there is, of course, being a science fiction book, there is access to medical care that allows for people to live substantially longer than they actually normally would. So he kind of mentions that he's been, an affiliate of or a major participant in a number of religions rather than just one, whereas Father Hoyt has only been a participant in Catholicism, though his devotion to it is definitely somewhat questionable. I'm not sure exactly how I would phrase that without giving too much away. So we're going to get right into what it is that Dan Simmons has to say about the ideas of immortality and about the ideas of Nietzsche right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMc Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Basic premise of the first chapter of Hyperion. So the premise, without giving away too much of the plot, is essentially that Father Hoyt is reading the journals of another man who traveled to Hyperion as part of his exile from the Catholic Church, which is kind of a funny way to start the novel, because it's like, hey, here's this character who is telling the story of another person who is not a character in this book. So I thought that that was interesting because he's kind of using Father Hoyt as, I wouldn't necessarily say like a proxy, but I just find it interesting that Father Hoyt isn't telling his own story. He's telling the story of another man, and the other man is his reason for going back, or what he believes is his reason for being selected as a member of this pilgrimage that's happening, like probably for the last time that anyone will be able to go to Hyperion, which I find it interesting that the hegemony believes that Hyperion is going to be destroyed by these ousters. It just, based off of the first chapter, it seems like Hyperion is a pretty unforgiving planet, and it has some pretty dangerous natural disasters that occur on it regularly. So it seems pretty hostile. So I don't really know what it is exactly that these ousters who are traveling to that planet, I don't know exactly what it is that they're kind of trying to accomplish, if you will. And I don't know exactly how much of it they're going to be able to accomplish, though there is some indication that like the man-made weapons and the futuristic technology that is able to be employed against the planet could ultimately lead to its demise. But just even based off of the first chapter alone, I just don't foresee any part of this going well for either side, and I think that probably is part of the point. So, Lenar Hoyt, the Father Hoyt, the person who tells their story first, is reading the journals of a man named Paul Duray. And Duray has been exiled to Hyperion from the home planet of the Catholic Church, which I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Pacha. And he is exiled for reasons that are kind of they're not necessarily disclosed, but I believe that he's released some form of data that causes the church to come under heavy amounts of scrutiny from within, theologically. So he isn't necessarily a whistleblower, more of, hey, we found this thing on another planet that might indicate something about our religion, and Duray believed that it was important enough to reveal to everybody, but the rest of the Vatican did not believe that. They call Pacha the New Vatican. So he is exiled, also kind of self-imposed into exile. He kind of has decided that for himself, though I think that there was kind of when someone is forced to resign, it was one of those situations is what it seems to be indicated as. And there's also some undertones of a potential relationship that Duray has with another man by the name of Edward or Eduardo. I can't remember. So I think that there's just there's several factors contributing to the eventual exile of Duray. But when Duray is exiled, he decides that he wants to basically perform a research mission on Hyperion and try to make contact with a specific group of natives on Hyperion called the Pakura. And the Pakura are pretty much the reason that I wanted to talk about this chapter, because the portrayal of them is of a specific interest in philosophy for me and for most individuals. So the eventual realization that Duray comes to is that the Pakura have achieved some form of immortality. And that ultimately that immortality has led to a specific type of living for them. So as we acquire knowledge about the Pakura, Father Duray is eventually able to find this civilization of the 70, which is 70 total. The Pakura are incredibly androgynous. He finds it very difficult at first to interact with them in a substantial manner because not only do they seem to be completely genderless, but they also don't have any individually based pronouns. So there's no he or she, and there's no I. And that is something that I find to be incredibly interesting that Simmons does very effectively, is portray this group of people where there is no individuality within that group of people. Everybody is ultimately not necessarily replaceable or expendable, but their existence isn't necessarily important in the same capacity. So his initial interaction with them comes after his guide is murdered in the night by the Pakura. And when he asks them, why did you kill him? They say, because anybody who doesn't follow the cruciform, or who isn't of the cruciform, needs to die the true death. And he doesn't understand this at first, and we do get we get exactly why they feel this way later on. But the Pakura are, I guess you could call it, of a religious sect, though honestly I have a hard time calling it a religious belief, because I think one of the intrinsic aspects of religious belief is that you have to have faith that something is going to occur, or that something exists beyond your understanding, or that you don't have knowledge of the existence of a particular thing. And the Pakura, they know their God, if you will. The faith that they have comes from a gift and a curse, a simultaneous gift and curse that has been granted to them by the Shrike, which is the primary kind of like deity-like being on Hyperion. And I think that a lot of the book is going to center around people's individual interactions with the Shrike. So I think that the Shrike is supposed to kind of represent this ambiguous, organized religion type of thing. And in this particular iteration, the Shrike has granted them, I guess, commune with this organism called the cruciform, which is in the shape of a cross. And it is an organism. It's some form of living organism that is implanted into the skin of individuals who are of the cruciform. It's implanted into the skin of those individuals, and it grants immortality. So when you die, it regenerates your body. So, and it can regenerate a body from pretty much any organic material. So, because what we find out is that when one of the Pakura dies and the body is unsalvageable, that cruciform is implanted onto another Pakura, and when it dies, eventually there will be, hypothetically, 2 Pakura born, quote unquote, or 2 Pakura regenerated from the body of that Pakura, and they'll continue being 70, because there's only supposed to be 70 of them. And that number 7 is a holy number in the Bible. I don't know exactly why. I should, because, I enjoy theology. But unfortunately for me, I just haven't been, unfortunately, I just haven't had the opportunity to delve into that particular aspect of theology. But I think that Simmons has, and that's why there's a presence of the idea of numbers, especially the idea of the number 7. There's 7 pilgrims, there's 70 Pakura, and I imagine that that's going to be something that repeats throughout the book. So, in this particular iteration of immortality, which does occur in a lot of science fiction, it is viewed ultimately as a curse, which I think is absolutely the appropriate way to view it, especially when you take into account the belief system that Nietzsche proposes in regards to the ideas of immortality. And we're going to get into what it is that Nietzsche says about religion and why it relates to Hyperion right after this quick.
I want to talk to you guys about this amazing product I've been using lately called Hydrant. If you're like me and you want to kick the coffee habit, but you're worried about your energy levels depleting, to avoid the morning sluggishness and that midday slump, you need to make sure you're hydrated. It's super important. And that's where I've been using Hydrant. And for 25% off your first order, you can go to drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC at checkout. Hydrant is basically flavored electrolyte packets you mix directly into your water to make hydrating your body easy and delicious. And what I love about Hydrant, it's backed by research. The formula was developed by Oxford scientists to provide perfectly balanced, efficient hydration. Again, that's drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC for 25% off your first order. Another really cool thing about Hydrant, there's no synthetic colors or artificial sweeteners. The formula is vegan and you can choose between 3 different flavors or a variety pack. So for all my vegan friendly fellows out there, this one's for you. Again, this is drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Say conflict necessarily, but like the main plot point that the Pecora serve in the first chapter of Hyperion. So just to summarize real quick, the Pecora have achieved a form of immortality, and I believe that this immortality is being portrayed in a way that is representative of the beliefs of Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is an existential philosopher from the early 1900s, if my brain or if my memory serves me correctly, which it has a tendency to do, but, I could be wrong. So please, if somebody realizes that I've said something incorrectly, definitely leave it in a review or a comment or add us on Twitter. So Nietzsche had this belief about religion, and this is why he is associated with nihilism, because he uses the term nihilism in this particular belief set, that because there is the availability of this idea of eternality inherent to most religions, the idea of an afterlife. Because there is an idea of an afterlife, it robs your current life of meaning. So basically, because I'm going to get to go to some perfect place in the sky, I don't need to worry about the contingencies, or the conditions would be a better word, the conditions of my current existence. So for instance, Nietzsche says, and this is one of his more controversial ideas, that the weak use morality to weaken the strong. And I don't necessarily agree or disagree with that wholeheartedly. I do have a tendency to lean towards it as being the right idea rather than the strong use morality to impose their will on the weak. I would say that morality, because it is the result of society and the larger group of people, that it ultimately hinders other individuals who would otherwise not be regular participants in society. Nietzsche is constantly exploring this idea of what it's like to be a quote-unquote genius, and he's not putting weight into that in a way that we would think of it today. When he says the idea of a genius, he's just talking about someone who exists outside of what is normally perceived as being human. In a weird way, Nietzsche is one of the most effective science fiction philosophers, in my opinion. Because one of the intrinsic aspects of his philosophy is that we should all exist as the alien from the rest of society. We should all exist, he says, uses the term the Übermensch quite frequently, and that is definitely something that I, as an individual, associate with, because he just believes that to just participate in social constructions and morality and things like that without actively pursuing why those things could be meaningful or advantageous for us, he believes that that is a form of nihilism, because ultimately it means that you don't believe in anything important, and therefore you don't believe in anything at all. And you need to be actively pursuing meaning and giving value to things based off of the pragmatic application of them in your life, and not based off of your obligation to them. And I am a firm believer in that. But anyway, all that to say, so Nietzsche believes that if immortality is an option, that it eliminates the necessity for individuality. It eliminates the necessity for prosperity. It creates this world where I can be poor and oppressed my entire life and feel that it's a good thing, because ultimately the overall scope of my existence, well, after I'm dead and eternity is the option, then that scope is much larger than my current scope of existence. And that is one of his biggest qualms with religion, is that it essentially gives everybody this out of, well, things suck now, but I'll get to live on forever in heaven, and heaven is this eternal paradise. And that's just, I think that that's a proper interpretation of social religion. I don't think that that's a proper interpretation of actual religion. If you're looking at, any religious text, ultimately, if the whole point is I get to live forever, then you're looking at a text that may as well be dead because it has no pragmatic purpose in the world around us. And there is really no reason to follow anything if it does not have pragmatic purpose. So the Pecora have achieved immortality. Whenever they die, they are regenerated because of the cruciform, which DeRay portrays as a parasite, which I could definitely agree with. Oftentimes in any kind of fantasy or science fiction, when immortality is something that a society has achieved, it is portrayed as being this curse, because you essentially have to watch everything else around you die and fade into or fade out of existence in some capacity. And so when you're immortal, there's this general degradation of meaning, because ultimately meaning is found often in the brevity of existence. So there's another book that called White Noise by Don DeLillo, where there's a specific conversation between the two characters who are trying to figure out, why is it that we believe life to be so meaningful? Why is it that we believe that things are so important? And ultimately, one of the questions asked is, well, do we believe that because it's so brief? Do we believe that because it can end? Because if something could just go on forever, then ultimately, how much meaning does it really have? Because it's not temporal. It exists outside of that. So I think the implication is that at some form, the Pecora were of a different physicality. They had individuals, they had the idea of an I in their language, and that because of their ability to achieve immortality, the 70, these 70 individuals not only wiped out the rest of the Pecora, but they also have maintained a strict boundary of, or were able to maintain a strict boundary of only having 70 of them. And they eventually, because when they are revived, they are slightly different than they were before, they eventually turned into the perfect organism to live in perpetuity. And they're revived not as like children, they're revived as like, I think DeRay believes them to be somewhere between their 30s and 50s, if you were going to put it in like standard years. So they're revived instantly pretty much as a fully realized adult. And there is some retention of the memory and the subconscious things that happen within the mind of these organisms after their resurrection. One of the Pecora that we are kind of endeared to, named Alpha, or nicknamed Alpha by DeRay, falls off a cliff and dies. And when he is brought back, he seems to remember DeRay in some capacity, but ultimately it seems like he's not fully formed in the same way that he was previously. And so there is this ever-present idea that the result of immortality is the destruction of the I and the creation of a we, rather. Though it seems like the only reference that the Pecora really have to individuals is their purpose within the 70, which I think is interesting. If not, it's just interesting because it portrays this profound idea that Nietzsche has, that ultimately if nothing is temporal, or if something's not temporal and it is truly timeless, then it doesn't have meaning because it will always exist forever and ever. And that in itself, the fact that Simmons is portraying this, is its own form of religious commentary, because there is this constant tension from DeRay and from Hoyt of like, well, is the church going to die? And does it need to die in order for it to have meaning? And I think that that's definitely something Simmons is trying to make a comment on, is that like even religious beliefs, we believe them to be eternal in some capacity. If they're not capable of quote unquote evolving or changing or shifting based on their pragmatic application within a society, if they're not able to be, universal in some new way or to be changed in some capacity, then ultimately they are meaningless in some odd way. And I don't necessarily agree with this commentary on religion, because I think that religion ought to exist in this kind of special space where the temporality of it isn't what gives it meaning. The universal aspect of it is what gives it meaning. But I appreciate what it is that Simmons is trying to say, at least what I think he's trying to say in this particular set of commentary, because it is something that I haven't seen in another science fiction book that makes religious commentary. So we're going to continue talking about this right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Summarize what we had been talking about previously, this idea that, religion creates this intrinsic nihilism, destroys the idea of the individual and such. And so, in reference specifically to Hyperion and the plot of Hyperion. So in this first chapter, when we first meet the Pecora, they reference this idea of the true death. And the true death comes from the fact that this person is not going to be revived in any capacity. And when Father DeRay asks, why didn't you kill me? They say, because you are of the Christo or the Christa or the Christe. And this is because they see a cross on his necklace while he's asleep. And they don't treat death in nearly the same way that we as individuals would. Not even in the way that we would treat like a dying animal. They just simply say, well, existence is or is not. They exist in a space of absolutes, which in itself is kind of religious commentary, because there is this theological undertone within existentialist theology that God exists as an absolute. He is the absolute form of being. So that in itself is kind of an implication that the Pecora are in a way gods, because they interact with the world in this sort of like detached, almost deistic way, where it's like things just kind of are set in motion and I am not necessarily an active participant in them. Though I will say I find it interesting that the Pecora do still eat They still have some form of socialization amongst themselves. And then they also have this, and this is an indication of the fact that I believe that they wiped each other out in order to get to the number 70, because, there's purpose in numbers here. There is this extreme taboo around the idea of nudity. And it, in fact, is what gets DeRay ultimately in trouble with the Pecora. And it's about the only thing that really upsets them is either a violation of the sacred space that they have. They have the specific space that they go to interact with the shrike, or interact with where they go to pray. It's an altar. And then the nudity taboo. So when DeRay accidentally violates that nudity taboo, he is imprisoned. And this is what eventually leads to him acquiring a cruciform of his own, which is that it's a cross-shaped, I guess, fleshy implant would be the way that I'd describe it. And so he gets this cross-shaped fleshy implant because he violates the religious space of the Pecora by sneaking down into this crag that leads to a basilica. And the basilica has this huge, ornate cross in it. And one of the things about Hyperion is that it has these time tombs, and it also is what's called a labyrinth world. And again, this is an emphasis on numbers. There are 9 labyrinth worlds in the known universe, and the labyrinths have no explanation. The labyrinths have no excavation marks. They have nothing to indicate that they are made by an active organism, and they kind of just are there and they exist in the same way that the Pecora do. It's an absolute form of existence that doesn't seem to have a beginning or an end. The Pecora definitely have a beginning, but they don't seem to have an end. And I think one of the big reasons that I see so much Nietzsche in this particular thing is because of that portrayal of immortality as being something that ultimately destroys the concept of an individual. When an individual dies and is constantly resurrected in some capacity, then that individual never ceases to exist. So because they don't cease to exist, there's no reason to apply the temporality of language to that individual. There's no reason to have a word for I if the I is perpetual. Because I, or, Keith, and Keith being my name, if Keith exists in an eternal fashion, then saying that Keith exists isn't necessarily pertinent, because Keith has become absolute. And so because existence has become absolute for all of the individuals in the Pecora society, there's no reason for them to continue to use the word I. And if they had a strict boundary on the number of people that they had in their tribe while they were still able to reproduce, then that would explain kind of like the nudity taboo, because they're not supposed to reproduce. So, and if they did reproduce, then that would mean that there's an individual that is not of the cruciform. Though we don't know that for sure. We don't know if the cruciform is something that's transferred by birth. It is apparently transferable by contact in some capacity, which I found to be interesting and also terrifying. But because of these things that were put in place long ago, eventually the necessity for certain aspects of their biology became obsolete. So DeRay is very interested in the study of the Pecora because they're the natives of the planet, and not interested in the conversion of the Pecora. He says that he doesn't want to travel to their society under the guise of being like a missionary. He wants to go there strictly to study them. So he brings a lot of medical equipment. And when he does finally get the chance to examine them as as medical specimens, what he finds is that they don't have any discernible genitalia, and there really is no gender to them. They eat and they produce waste out of a very primitive cloaca. And a cloaca is something that an organism that only has 1 to 2 orifices has. And the cloaca essentially serves like on birds. Birds defecate and release waste through their cloaca, but they also release reproductive material through their cloaca. It's all through the same part of their body. And so more simple organisms on the evolutionary chain have a tendency to have a cloaca. And in addition to that, when we first get a portrayal of the Pecora, they're described as being similar to having Down syndrome in the way that DeRay sees them. And I think this is interesting because to him, they seem simple. But the reality is that they exist as something that's totally alien to our concept of the world, because the way in which they interact with existence itself is intrinsically and forever altered by the fact that they just continue in this perpetual existence. And the other interesting thing about this particular commentary is that it absolutely is kind of a commentary on the idea of Theseus's ship, where if something changes in a certain capacity, how much change is necessary for it to be viewed as a new thing. And I think that's a pretty common thing for us to see in a lot of writing. And one of the things that I think is really great about this particular bit of writing from Simmons is that he combines so many like mythologies and philosophies all in this one story that I'm really interested in seeing what it is that he does with the rest of them. So I'm going to kind of go over some of the other themes that occur within the story, the other allusions that I saw in this writing. And we'll do that right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMc Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMc Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMc Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMc in the search bar.
I had kind of indicated that we were going to go over some of the other themes or allusions present in this story of the Pecora in the first chapter of Hyperion. So one of the other, there are several other important allusions that I've mentioned before on the podcast, which I think it's funny that these things keep popping up. I'm curious as to whether or not it's just really that there isn't anything new under the sun, or if have some sort of confirmation bias and I'm seeing these interpretations frequently, or if it's just that a lot of people who do good storytelling use these elements. So one of the unique and interesting things about this story is that it not only includes the ideas of Nietzsche and his kind of like will to power ideas, but it also includes a pretty strong reference to the myth of Sisyphus or of Prometheus especially. So the Shrike is supposed to be this avatar of death, which is, told to us pretty on in the story, or early on in the story, is that the Shrike grants some form of knowledge or wish or what have you to an individual. And it kind of has this like monkey paw vibe to it, but not monkey paw in the sense that it's sinister in its intent, but monkey paw in the sense that kind of like we know not what we do when we ask for certain things to become reality, because we aren't gods in some capacity. But this idea of the Sisyphean myth, or especially of Prometheus, is pretty strong throughout the story of the Pecora, because there is this perception of suffering by DeRay when he acquires his cruciform, where he is constantly trying to remove it because he realizes what it does, and he doesn't want to be cursed with that. He begins to wonder if he'll eventually turn into one of the 70, because it seems like every time the 70 are revived, there's some sort of individuality that's stripped from them, or some form of identification that is stripped from them. He specifically mentions that Alpha only slightly resembles Alpha, and that it ultimately, that being is only Alpha in the most remote sense of being Alpha. It's not the original Pecora that he viewed as being alpha. And this is that Theseus ship idea, where it's like how much of an organism can change while still remaining true to the original thing that it was. How much of an identity is really associated with certain aspects of being. And so he kind of realizes that the cruciform represents this process of stripping an organism of its individuality and I guess assimilating it into the overall whole of the cruciform's being. And the cruciform has a mind of its own. Once Duray gets it, he realizes that he wants to leave, and the cruciform will literally not let him leave a certain range of space. It will take over his body and make him want to crawl back to the area near the basilica. And it has a mind of its own. It doesn't like pain. He specifically finds out that through an examination that when one of the Pecora breaks a bone, that the cruciform reacts very poorly and releases all these, or causes the body of the thing it's in to release all these endorphins, and it doesn't like the process of pain that an organism goes through. So my guess is that that's something that the cruciform might cause to evolve out of an organism that it's infected. But in this particular case, the Pecora simply kill the individual who's broken their leg and then take it down and let it get revived into a new, quote-unquote, new Pecora, which is terrifying, but especially for Duray, because what he is curious of is like, how many times will I die and be revived until, I've lost my identity as an individual? Will I lose he says manhood specifically, will I lose all these other identifying aspects of myself to this thing that grants immortality? And one of the big reasons that I think Nietzsche is so present in this commentary is that meaning and the responsibility of meaning ultimately falls onto the necessity of temporality and not of eternality. And just to kind of further explore this particular iteration of the idea of immortality, and do I think that it's an accurate commentary on the way in which an organism might interact with immortality, I feel like this commentary is incredibly poignant for a multitude of reasons. I think that we as individuals ultimately find a lot of meaning in the temporary nature of things around us. This thing might not exist forever, so I need to experience it as much as possible in this moment because it wouldn't exist otherwise. One example from my own personal life is I'm from the Sacramento area, and we had a record store called Dimple that has been in business since before I was born, which was 1990. I turned 30 this year, so woo. So this business has been open for as long as I have been able to perceive the world as being a thing, as long as I've been able to perceive myself as being a thing. And in the last year, it closed. And I felt this very profound sense of loss and this very unique sense of brevity in the existence of something as simple as a business. And if Dimple had just existed forever, then I would have never had the opportunity to reflect on what it actually meant to me unless I actively thought about what does this place actually mean to me. And that is kind of the way in which Dan Simmons is trying to say that we interact with life. How much of life is really meaningful to me as an individual if I'm looking at it as something that never ends, or if I'm looking at it as something that just changes in small degrees. If things aren't capable of being changed drastically enough to constitute the existence of something new, then I'm just viewing something as this natural thing that exists in perpetuity, that has meaning in its existence but doesn't have personal meaning. And that, I think, is a big reason why Simmons chose to portray this immortality as being something that robs the individual of their individualness. Because when you exist in perpetuity and you know that all things exist in perpetuity, well then nothing truly dies. And, you don't ever lose anything. And without that loss, you're not inspired to reflect on the value of that thing. There is a commencement speech done by an author named David Foster Wallace called This Is Water. And it's something that has, I've listened to it several times. Every time I listen to it, I find a new nugget of information or a new thing to relate to. And it relies on the awareness of individuals needing to come into being. It's a commencement speech at a liberal arts college, and Wallace's point is primarily that meaning doesn't come from a place of absolution. It comes from a place of actualization. We have to actualize the meaning of things around us. And he starts it with this kind of like pithy anecdote where he says there's two fish that are swimming along, and they run into this older fish who says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And the one fish looks at the other after that older fish has swam by and says, "What the heck is water?" And this, I think, is essentially the same thing that Simmons is saying in his commentary or in his portrayal of immortality. If water is something that we are unaware of, this thing that gives us life, if I'm a fish, I live in water, I breathe water, quote unquote, my gills extract oxygen from water, however you want to say that scientifically correctly. This thing that exists is the only way by which I can continue to exist in the way that I exist. Now, let's take that and zoom way out and look at that as life. The actual act of biological life. If someone were to ask me, how are your cells today? I'm not going to think I'm not going to have ever thought about that. How are my cells today? And that to me says that I'm not valuing something that deserves to be valued. So if we get down to the nitty gritty of, how's your life? How's your existence today? Well, if my existence exists in such an intrinsically eternal capacity that I don't have to actually reflect on it, then a lot of the trappings of our current understanding of life kind of fall away because there's no need for me to examine them. I have no need to look at, if I'm a fish, I have no need to look at water and wonder, how's the water? The water simply is, and I exist within it. I have no reason to apply meaning. And the same thing is applicable in life. If I just am, if I just exist in perpetuity without the ability to be an active agent in anything, then there's no reason for me to look at that as being something that's valuable because I'm not being forced to look at it as temporary or meaningful because nothing is created or lost in that process. And I'm going to continue talking about this as we kind of draw to a conclusion about this first chapter of Hyperion right after this last commercial break.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMc Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMc in the search bar.
This is going to be our last kind of segment that we're going to talk about Hyperion for today. I'm sure that we'll reference this chapter in future discussions about Hyperion because I absolutely will be listening to the rest of this book. I'm thinking I'm going to try to split up the episodes, so one will be about Hyperion and then the other will be about something else, just because I know that if you are reading the book or listening to the book, you don't have as much time to get through it as quickly as I am going to force myself to, because you're not recording a podcast about it. So right before the break, I'd kind of introduced this idea of the speech, "This is Water" by David Foster Wallace, and had kind of given some personal examples into my life and as to why I found this commentary on existence to be so meaningful and so poignant. I really think that for this to be the first chapter is pretty powerful, especially because it's titled "The Man Who Cried God." And I am sure that a lot of these chapters are going to be titled in ways that are kind of reflective of the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, and I really appreciate and find it an incredible accomplishment of intellectualism that Simmons is able to include these references and structure these things in such a way that actually reflects the theme that he's going for. That's something, as an author myself, it's very difficult to do. I tried to write a short story at some point about an individual who was trapped on a spaceship who goes through all of the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. And just in that, small interaction, it was incredibly difficult for me to, portray that. I'll probably pick up that short story again and start trying to write it again. Regardless, The reason that I wanted to bring up the title is because I think that Father de Rey is portrayed as this individual who has a pattern of behavior where he's constantly looking for affirmation in his faith. He's constantly looking for God to speak to him, or God to, he cries out to God so many times. And every time, and not every time, but it's several times where it seems very important, he has come to this space where he believes that he's found God in some capacity. And he even believes this when he gets into the Basilica initially. He gets down to the Basilica and says I've found this thing. He writes in his journal to Eduardo, who I don't think will ever read it. He probably has died, especially because of the time debt that's incurred between traveling to Hyperion and the time that passes on Pacha, the world that he hails from. But he's writing to him, and after he finds the Basilica, he says, "I have to tell somebody about this. I would literally rather die than this information not get to the right person, because it absolutely has to get to somebody. Somebody needs to read this and figure this out, because I've found God." And he did the same thing with the previous thing that got him exiled in the first place. He found this information and said, "I believe that everybody needs to know this because I found God." And that in itself is an incredibly interesting way for Simmons to comment on the way that individuals interact with organized religion and interact with belief structures. We are constantly, as humans, searching for meaning, searching for value. And this is part of the reason why the idea of immortality is so terrifying, because it intrinsically degrades the value of individuals, degrades the value of meaning. And so we've got this combination of this thing that everybody seems to subconsciously desire, because we all subconsciously desire a form of eternality. That's part of the reason why religion is desirable in the first place. It's also part of the reason that we're driven to have children. It is genetically encoded in us to create some form of eternality of our existence. And so we are given this commentary of this person is looking for eternality. They're looking for a form of perpetual existence, and they find it. And then they think, I found God. I found this thing that gives so much meaning. And then ultimately what they find out is this was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and it's too late. I have cried God too many times, and I've said I've found God, and ultimately I have found a curse. I have found this perpetual existence that saps the meaning from life, that ultimately destroys me. And the fact that he would be able to so effectively portray such a simple moral story of, the boy who cried wolf, to portray something so simple in such a complex way, using this seemingly benign trope from science fiction writing in general, is incredible. It is an accomplishment of intellectualism in itself. I think that, and I've mentioned this before on my episodes about escapism, authors and individuals who consume art, the ones who can find enjoyment and profound meaning in the most simple of things are usually the ones who really have the best insight into the more complex things. And I would say the same thing is true of Simmons in his writing. The more that you can kind of extract truly deep and meaningful human experiences into something that's universal that people experience on a regular basis without even knowing it, and then portray that in a complex way that still gets at the simple point of a story, the simple moral of the story being don't cry wolf. The more that you're able to do that, the more effectively you can do that, the better it is that you are going to be as a storyteller. And I was just profoundly impacted by the fact that he could take this incredibly simple story, this incredibly simple little myth. I'm not sure if it's in the actual Canterbury Tales. I don't know if The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a part of that collection. But if it is, then even more applause is deserved in my opinion. He's able to take this simple moral and say, this is what we do with things that are truly hard to acquire. That we're constantly looking for this profound sense of meaning and purpose and individuality. And every time we find it, we think that, or we act in a way that we found something that nobody else is aware of. And even the Pecora are portrayed to us as being unaware. They're portrayed to us as being these inactive agents, but they specifically have laws in place that created the 70. They specifically have laws and things in place that continue the existence of there only being 70. And they have a zealotry for that necessitates some form of agency. So the premature crying of I've found God or I've found this thing by Father Duray is a profound commentary, in my opinion, on the way that people interact with belief structures and interact with the idea of a confirmation bias. Someone will say, I've found this incredibly meaningful thing, and everybody must believe the same way that I do. I mean, that's essentially what evangelism in any religion boils down to. I have access to this thing, you need to have access to it too, and you should act in accordance to its laws and in accordance to everything about it. And ultimately, when Duray does this, he finds that it is a terrible blight on his life, that he now knows that he will live in perpetuity no matter what it is that he does. He has no agency any longer in the temporality of his existence, and that is a terrifying prospect for him. And the fact that Simmons is able to so effectively portray that is incredible, especially within this essentially short quasi-fable set in this science fiction realm. I think that it really, if you look at it as something that necessitates reflection, it really is driving us as individuals to turn around and look at our lives and say, well, how much value do I really provide to other people by claiming that I have this exclusive knowledge that they don't? How meaningful is it really, or how much purpose does it really serve for me to say I have access to this thing that you don't, and you should live in the same way that I do in order to gain access to it? Because ultimately, what's a blessing to one person is absolutely a curse to another, and what's good or bad is so drastically relative that we as individuals miss out on the fact that other people have their own agency and their own desires. And the more that we try to force them into believing or agreeing with the things that or the things and the ways in which we see the world, the more we're stripping them of that individuality. And that's exactly what the cruciform and the shrike in this particular instance represent. It is a destruction of all that is human, all that is meaningful. It is the true nihilism, represented by a construct on this world of Hyperion. And that's part of why it is so abjectly terrifying. And this is just chapter 1, so I'm really looking forward to the multiple ways in which the shrike is kind of represented as a metaphor. But in this particular instance, I think the biggest takeaway here is that the shrike, to Father Hoyt, represents this idea of nothingness. And the idea of nothingness, the idea of complete and total lack of meaning, is something that's so profoundly terrifying that he has to go back and attempt to reconcile that meaninglessness, has to go back and attempt to find out the true extent of that meaningless and find out how much nothingness is there really in the idea of existence. Because if you look at, just real quick, the Hegel dialectic, right, philosophically speaking, is that a word exists in juxtaposition to a lack. So I say I have purpose because I lack purpose, right? When I'm saying I have purpose, it's because there is a presence of lack of purpose. I'm necessitating purpose. And that is exactly what it is that Hoyt is trying to reconcile. He's found that the Shrike is representative of nothingness, which means that there is this intrinsic desire in him to give it meaning. And that is something that is so profoundly human and so able to be, or so well captured by Simmons that I couldn't help but talk about this book. So we're going to wrap it up for today. I really appreciate you guys listening. Like I said, probably tune in next Sunday and we'll talk about the next chapter, the next tale in this book. I'm really excited to keep reading it. I definitely recommend picking it up if you have an Audible subscription. I think it's around like $20 if you've already used your credit for the month. If you haven't, then, save up these episodes, listen to the ones on Wednesday, and then get it at the beginning of next month, which is in a week. So highly recommend it. It's really, really good. If you're into science fiction, if you're into literature, I would really recommend it. And hopefully we're going to be able to get some form of active discussion and some questions asked between myself and you, the audience. I'm looking to establish that with the hosts of the podcast, with the GSMc Podcast Network. So thanks again for joining me. Definitely give us a like, subscribe, review us, tweet at us, GSMc Sci-Fi Podcast. Would love to hear from you guys. Would love to be able to answer some questions from you. So please do try to find us on Twitter and send us some questions so that I can kind of figure out what engagement looks like from you guys, and engage with you, because I feel kind of like I'm putting things out into the ether and having no idea how they're being received. So I'd love to hear back from everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe out there. Hopefully you guys check out this book. Again, I cannot recommend it enough. So have a great day. Thanks again, guys.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.